All right, it is 7 o'clock, and more people hopefully will join us later, but I want to be respectful of the people who are here now. So why don't we go ahead and get started? If anybody would like to ask a question, oh, there's a sign behind me. We had a bunch of those made up for the convention that, you know, we're not having. Yeah, okay. There's a place to hang it. If you've got a question, go ahead and put it in the chat. And I was given some questions beforehand, and I've got to remember to look at the camera, not down at myself here. No, that takes a bit of getting used to, but I guess as video calls get normal, we'll get used to that. So I'm going to just go ahead and get started. So the first question here is requiring liability insurance to own a gun fair to gun owners. So that's referring to my proposal that liability insurance be mandatory for gun owners. And there's been some pushback on that. Somewhat you might expect, you know, the Second Amendment, it's a right to have a gun. And the other actually being economic, that requiring gun owners to have liability insurance is a financial imposition on gun owners of more limited financial means. And I get it. You know, the guns cost money in the first place. That they can be expensive. Ammunition costs money. Fees for the target for shooting ranges can cost money. But none of that actually affects, you know, whether you are able to pay. That's okay. We'll just leave it. I think there are my buttons. Okay. Ta-da. All right. Sorry about that. None of the expenses that gun owners undergo have anything to do with whether they can cover their liability if they cause damages to somebody else, you know, or hunters too. Hunters pay a license fee. That's an expense, and I know hunting equipment's expensive, but the license fee is to pay for the management of game. It's not to cover if, you know, one hunter mistakes another hunter for a deer and accidentally shoots somebody. So I see it as very much like driving a car. If you want to get a driver's license, you have to have liability insurance. And the fact that you're financially stressed and it's hard to afford the car does not get you out of the neat requirement that you get the liability insurance. It's not a matter of your finances. It's a matter of your ability to compensate somebody who you've done damage for. And I think it should be the same thing with guns. If you're a responsible gun owner, if you want to have all the guns you want, fine, have the insurance so that if you do damage to somebody, you can cover it. And I get it's an expense. I'm a historic reenactor. So, you know, I mean, the guns I use will be muzzle loaders, and it takes 30 seconds to load each shot, and when we're at events, it's you need to turn the sound off. Okay. But when I go to reenactment, either the group I'm with or the event organizers have to have insurance, just in case with, even if we're firing blanks, we injure somebody, even though it's an expense. So I don't think it's at all unreasonable to say if you're a responsible gun owner, get liability insurance. And of course, the other argument is the Second Amendment. It's your right to have a gun, and requiring insurance interferes with the right to have a gun. Well, you might have a right to have a gun, but you don't have a right to shoot somebody. And you don't have a right to accidentally cause damage to somebody else and face no repercussions for that. That's a whole different thing. So that is why I want responsible gun owners to get liability insurance. And if you won't get liability insurance, or your record is so bad you can't get it, then no, you shouldn't have that gun any more than if you are an irresponsible driver, maybe nobody's going to insure you. All right, you need to turn the sound down. Okay. All right, next question. Can a freeway tunnel roof hold a house? This is something I've gotten a lot. Can you put a roof over a freeway and actually build on it? And the answer is very much yes. You'd maybe be surprised at just how much weight those things hold. Our local example is that the Hiawatha Avenue tunnel. It was Hiawatha Avenue covered over to turn it into a tunnel and reconnect the two parts of Minnehaha Park. And you can drive over that tunnel. You have no idea you're on top of a tunnel. Now, people aren't living up there. But in cities where they tried these land lids or land bridges, as they call them, other cities have done parks. They've done it on a smaller scale than what I'm proposing, but they have built parks on top of these land lids, and these parks have park buildings, and every park building I've ever seen was a lot bigger and a lot heavier than a house. So, you know, they probably have the weight of small apartment buildings. So yes, absolutely, absolutely, these things can hold, you know, a bunch of weight of a bunch of houses or small apartment buildings. And the reason I want to build houses is because we have a chronic housing shortage in the central cities and the inner suburbs. We lost a lot of land when the freeways are built. They tore out a lot of housing, and now we have chronic housing shortages. So that's why I want to build housing, recover it by covering the freeway trenches wherever we can. And, you know, there's probably other parts of the state where that can work, not just right in the middle of the metro area. All right, and I'm going to look in the chat here. See, okay. Ethanol is questionable environmentally. I agree, but good market for Minnesota farmers. That's quite true. In view of Governor Walz's One Minnesota approach, is that enough reason to continue support for ethanol subsidies? I see it kind of two ways, because I'll admit, as a driver, I like ethanol in my gasoline in the winter because my gas line doesn't freeze anymore. That's great. But we were told that ethanol was going to be a bridge technology, and eventually we could use more marginal land that wouldn't have to grow corn. We could use natural prairie grass, and we haven't gotten there. And that's a lot of why I'm an ethanol skeptic. We're growing corn in land that maybe shouldn't grow corn, and we're sucking out aquifers because the land is too dry, or the land is too wet and it gets drained into the rivers. So I will be more in favor of ethanol if we could switch over to natural prairie grass. And if we can't, yeah, we do need to reconsider it. It's good for the farmers, but it's being really terrible for our land. And now you know this is live. Hang on a second. Honey, can you get the tea I left in the microwave? Thanks. Okay, so if you're wondering if it was live, there you go, folks. So here's a question. What experience do I have with GOTV organizing? I've worked as an organizer for campaigns. I was on the coordinated campaign staff in 2016. And I've worked for some other candidates. And as a chair, basically what a lot of what you do is organizing. Not just get out the votes. In fact, it kind of comes late towards the end. Earlier on in the campaign cycle, organizing door knocks and phone banks. And of course, it's recruiting volunteers really year round for a lot of things. Running caucuses, obviously, is a big one, and the convention, and thank you so much, and forums and fundraisers. If you're a chair, you have to be partly an organizer. You have to have people skills. You have to be diplomatic. You have to be able to get people who don't agree with each other to all pull in the same general direction. So I think that's a strength I really would bring to being in the legislature, where, of course, it's politics. It's still person to person. And I'm going to have to work with, even my DFL colleagues will probably have to be sold on a lot of new big plans. And to be sure, sometimes I'll have to establish some kind of relationship with some Republicans, because even if we have the majority, we'll probably need Republicans to get a supermajority for a bonding bill. All right. About 1/3 of drivers don't have a valid car insurance. I wouldn't know. I'll just leave that for, I guess. Would a similar thing happen with gun insurance? Many people, gun owners not carrying insurance. Maybe. But I can tell you that if someone's driving without insurance, they're going to be stopped. When the police find them driving without insurance, they can stop them driving then, and they don't have to let them go and wait until they blow through an intersection and bash into somebody, because driving without insurance is an offense in itself. And that's the way I see gun liability insurance. If someone doesn't have liability insurance, we don't need to wait for them to commit a mugging, because they're already breaking the law. That apartment project, did, okay, more get out the vote. What we do to get out the vote for the 2020 election, and that apartment project we did is get out the vote. Yes. So that, Mark, is something, thanks for the reminder. When I was chair, one of my first projects was collecting information on the apartment buildings in what was then our newly redrawn district. And I did a lot of research online to find the buildings that were in the district, and then I would take a precinct and find a volunteer, and did some myself, of course. And we would go street by street, confirming the information I found online and finding other multi-unit buildings that we hadn't found. So we confirmed the addresses. Sometimes it'd be the phone number to contact the management. We might know how many units there were. If the building was just under construction, which happens a lot in this district. And so that facilitated organizing by targeting apartment buildings. And the reason I wanted to do that is that when we're doing not just GOTV, probably even earlier than that, but all the canvassing year round, we tend to just look at single family houses where it's easier to get to the doors, and you have to do work sometimes to arrange to get to apartment buildings. You arrange to get into bigger buildings, or maybe you find clusters of smaller buildings that may have open doors that you can go into. And it took a while to break people the habit of skipping apartment buildings. I mean, we tried another project later on. We were working on voter registrations, and somebody who drew some districts for me made a point of eliminating the apartment buildings, which was kind of the opposite of what we'd actually wanted to do at that point. And I remember going on a door knock with Gene McGenius. We went out to I think it was Benson. It was a small town in the western part of the state, and one of the local campaign staff was surprised that we went into an apartment building. The apartment buildings there didn't lock their front doors. It just hadn't occurred to them to focus on apartment buildings, but they're overlooking a lot of people. What will you do to get out the vote for the 2020 election? Well, there you go. Apartment buildings, we miss a lot of people. I can also tell you that it's different if we're talking about the primary and the general election. If I'm running in the primary, which is only going to be if I'm endorsed, I'm abiding by the endorsement. So if somebody else gets the endorsement, I'm going to feel sorry for myself for a day or two. I understand losing elections is like one of the worst days of your life. I guess I'll find out if that happens to me. Then I'm going to suck it up. I'm going to help the endorsee in a contested primary if we have one. And then, of course, in November, we're not going to really focus on the state legislative race in the Deep Blue district. We're going to be focusing on the statewide races. And if I'm fortunate enough to be our candidate in the general election, as a responsible legislator, I have to go talk to my constituents. But my concern is going to be much more president and senator. So what I will do, I'm going to really push to go to the areas where we don't go all that often. And we have a lot of apartment buildings in our district, since it's intersuburban and urban. And there's a lot of construction going on. And something interesting, because we have these new buildings, everybody in those buildings has to register to vote. And by making a point of getting in there, we're getting in there ahead of the Republicans. Actually, the Republicans probably aren't going to bother. But we'll find out about them first. Maybe you can contact them to try and register them to vote and find out if they're willing to support Democrats. Is the education gap a failure in public education and something that can be fixed by public education alone? I consider myself a charter school skeptic, and I think we really need to go with neighborhood schools. And the reason I'm skeptical is that in most states, not so much Minnesota, where they have to be nonprofits, but in other states, charter schools have been a way of privatizing education, just sucking money for private business out of the public school system. And when you look at the corruption and the failure rates, I'm very skeptical about charters. We have to try to make public schools work. There's currently a proposal in Minneapolis to revise how school districts are cut up. And I'm of two minds. On the one hand, as a state legislator, I don't think it's my place to get into the details of how the school board runs the local schools. They know a lot more than I do. And I'm going to be inclined to let the local school boards run their schools. On the other hand, I live in Minneapolis, so I really care how that turns out. But I'll admit, I don't know what the best way. It seems like everybody's got the same goals, but we keep struggling with it. The core problem is we just want to underfund our schools. I mean, I don't know how you can overspend on schools. What happens if you spend too much money in the public schools? Do the roofs not leak enough? Are the textbooks, not old enough? Is there too much lab equipment? So let's invest in our public schools. Let's spend let's go ahead and spend freely. That's a place where we shouldn't really worry about the spending. Let's see. As a high school kid I was mentoring, he had no homework, no desk, quiet space, no good lighting. Yeah, we expect our schools to compensate for a lot of problems that kids bring in with them that aren't directly related to education. Anecdotally, I've heard of a lot of classrooms where half the kids turn over during the course of the school year. It's just that transitory. And as a kid myself, the family moved a lot, and it seems like either we moved or it was time for me to change schools. And so I went to a different school every year for a bunch of years. So, in history class, I had the early explorers 5 times and never got to World War II. If kids have insecure housing, this makes education a lot harder. We can't expect schools to fix it. That's a housing problem. The schools shouldn't be expected to fix that. Or we had the lunch shaming incident in Richfield, and other schools have had that. So kids can't afford an $8 debt for lunch, and so the school is having to spend time running around trying to get $8 out of a kid who doesn't have it. This is ridiculous. Let's just fund school lunches. We make them free for lower income students anyway. Just make them free for everybody. Don't worry about who's lower income. The COVID experience is creating a major hit on the state's finances. Yes. What can we do to increase state revenues? Do you remember what Mark Dayton ran on back in 2010? His campaign message was tax the rich. And it was straightforward. It was simple. People understood it. The Democrats who ran with it had a simple message to run on. And he won only narrowly, but remember, he won in a red wave. Voters accepted that message. And once he had a DFL legislature that would cooperate with him, he only had 2 years of that in his 8 years, remember. They managed to fix our perpetual budget holes. We had holes in the budget every year. There was a budget shortfall, and the parties fighting over it, and the legislature fighting with the governor. But once we had DFL control, since then, no budget holes. So let's do the obvious thing. Tax the rich, the people who got the Trump tax breaks. The alternatives are we're going to raise taxes on everybody else at a time when ability to pay is reduced, or we're going to cut spending when the need is greater. And obviously, I don't want to do either of those. And that's why it's important that Democrats get a hold of both houses of the legislature. We have governor already. If we have that trifecta, we can do this. If Republicans still have a house of the legislature, we're going to be forced into a compromise where we raise taxes further down the income scale, or we cut spending on people at the worst time. So let me take another question here. Do you support the state compact to give electoral votes to the popular vote winner? Actually, that's been a pet peeve of mine since I was a precocious adolescent, first learning about it. It seemed like a really stupid idea then. And now I'd say it's an idea that actually is endangering the existence of the American Republic. I mean, without the Electoral College, Donald Trump does not get into the White House. George W. Bush does not get into the White House. The disaster that we've had this century probably don't happen. I mean, I really think the Electoral College was supposed to insulate the country from the bad decisions of the people, and instead the Electoral College foisted bad decisions on the people. It needs to go. I mean, the only reason for not calling it obsolete is that it never made any sense. The framers of the Constitution assumed that people understood they knew their local officials. They would know about the prominent men in their state, but they wouldn't know anything about national politics. Well, when you look at like newspapers from 1805, you will find that people were talking about national politics. That's what they were familiar with. Just like people now, they knew a lot more about the president than they did about the governor or their state legislators. So maybe I should explain the compact. So if states assign on to a degree that they're going to give their electoral college votes to the winner of the popular vote in the presidential election. And it goes into effect when enough states have signed on to make up a majority of the electoral college. So in effect, the popular vote would then decide the presidency. So yes, I am very much in favor of that. And good question here. Will car pollution harm people living in housing over the freeways? I think it actually might protect them from it. Certainly it'll stop noise pollution. And tunnels already have to have systems for venting the exhaust and in populated areas. So that's an engineering challenge that I don't know the solution to, but it's already been solved in other places. And if you go along the freeways as they exist now, you'll see a lot of neighborhoods have sound barriers, and they cut down the sound. They're also frankly butt ugly. And even if we could just maybe extend overpasses wider, not if you could build anything on, just make them wider, that would cut down on the noise pollution. That would be a real benefit to the people who live along the freeway, because just like the freeways were built through lower income minority neighborhoods, they didn't go through the wealthy white areas. People who live along the freeways still tend to be more lower income. So I think that would be a benefit to them, to be able to replace a sound barrier with a lid that cuts out most of the noise. And I don't know what the engineering is that vents out the air pollution. I know it's done. Yeah, and Paul here points out the Electoral College is also created to get slave states and small states to join the Union. Yeah, that was part of that 3/5 rule for deciding that slaves would only count as 3/5 of a person. It was a compromise between the slave states, and you can't really call them free states because slavery was legal everywhere. Nobody abolished it yet, but the states where slavery wasn't so common. And that was a way that they counted the slaves for purposes of deciding population. Partly the slave states wanted to count them completely because they get more representation. The free states said, well, you don't even let these folks vote, that you shouldn't be able to count them as part of your population. And that was part of the compromise. And a question for the compact, what about states where they suppress votes like Georgia? Yeah, that's a reasonable point. But then again, remember Florida in 2000? Bush won that by 230 votes, something like that. And they had managed to kick tens of thousands of black voters off the registration rolls, and of course didn't tell them. That happens anyway. And with the Electoral College, you need to pull it off maybe literally just one state to steal a whole election. So I think this actually makes the problem better, because you wouldn't have to fight over 200 votes in Florida. That might decide Florida, but it's only 200 votes in the whole country. Legalize weed. Yeah, I'm in favor of legalizing marijuana because it'll save money on jailing people, on law enforcement. Our police could do something other than busting drug users. We'll save money on courts. So I don't know how much money there is to be made in terms of taxing it, but I think it would be a money saver in what we wouldn't spend anymore. And I know Colorado has brought in about $300 million in the last year, I think it is, in marijuana revenues. Whether that's going to be normal, whether we could do that, I don't know. There might be something. Though, if you're thinking that then we just wouldn't have to regulate marijuana at all, do be aware that if you say, marijuana is no more dangerous than alcohol, alcohol can be pretty dangerous. I mean, I've had alcoholics in my family. I know this the hard way. So we're going to still have regulation on marijuana, how old you have to be to buy it. And if we're taxing it, we're going to have to enforce the tax law. So we won't be busting people for drug use, but we will have to be willing to bust people for tax evasion. So there will still be some regulation, but I think that's going to be a whole lot better than what we have now. We're filling up our jails with drug users or really low-level dealers. Yeah, leave room in jails for those breaking into cars and garages. Yeah, completely agree with that. Would free college include graduate level? Okay, so what this is referring to is, excuse me. What this is referring to is Commit to Minnesota by Free College Plan, where post-secondary education, technical 2-year, 4-year, is going to be free for students who stay in Minnesota for 5 years after they leave school. And I've been asked if this would include graduate school, and I'm open to that idea. I'm guessing it'll be an easier sell politically to start out with 4-year, 2-year, and technical. Even 4-year might be a pull, given how many people keep proposing 2-year free college. But possibly, I could see, given the greater expense, that maybe it would come with the additional qualification that you would have to agree not just to stay in Minnesota, but to go to a part of the state where your profession was in short supply. So an area where they were short of doctors or short of teachers or something. And I'm willing to work that out, because there's obviously a benefit to everybody, into people advancing all the way. Something going on? No, my screen blanked for a second. Sorry. As much as is a benefit to everybody, state as a whole, if more people have greater degrees of education, that's still true, with even higher levels, masters or doctorates. So yeah, we absolutely can think about it. Maybe it'd have to be more than 5 years. So I don't have that definitively figured out, but I'm quite open to it. Will you oppose right to work laws? Oh yeah. Yeah, and could we stop using the other side's framing? Because I know that's the common terminology, but people who want to bust unions came up with the phrase right to work. Call it right to freeload, because what this is that people who work in a union shop don't have to pay union dues if they don't want to, but they still get all the union services for free. So under fair share, which is what we generally done in Minnesota and what closed shop states have done, a fair share means that you have to pay dues to cover the cost of the collective bargaining agreements. So you file a grievance, the union has to support you in that. That cost is covered in negotiation, whatever it takes to administer the collective bargaining agreement. You have to pay that part, but you don't have to pay the part that goes to organizing. If you don't like unions, that's your right. You don't have to pay for more organizing. You don't have to pay for political activity. But right to work, right to freeload, says that you can have all the services and just not pay. It's supposed to break unions financially. And now imagine we did that with any other institution. If there was a government that had to provide full services, even if somebody didn't want to pay any taxes, taxation was purely voluntary. Pay if you want to, but the government still has to provide services. Still has to fix the streets and fix the lights or defend the country. And how long is that going to keep up if taxation is just voluntary? Hey, remember during the Revolution under the Articles of Confederation, as long as we're getting to early Republic history there, that was part of that problem, was that there was no taxing power in the part of the central government. States had to volunteer to pay money, and they didn't. So yeah, or a business. Imagine a business was required to provide its goods or services, but it couldn't ask anybody. It couldn't require anybody to pay. It could ask people to pay, but they don't want to pay. They didn't have to pay. That's obviously not going to work and break the business. So that's what right to work is. It's supposed to break unions. So don't call it right to work. Call it right to freeload. And as you can guess, I'm a strong union supporter. I'm absolutely positively against that. Are you supportive of legalizing psychedelics? Honestly, I don't think I know enough to have an opinion. I'm skeptical, but I think I'd want to learn more. That's probably not, the precise answer that you're looking for. I honestly, I don't know. I have some skepticism. Let's do one thing at a time. Let's try to legalize marijuana because that's where there's a big user base and a lot of people going to jail. Start there. And I think that's going to tell us a lot about what we can do with other drug legalizations. And Paul says, we might go Poland on that. Good idea. Good idea. I will look into that. Do states have the right to defy Trump on staying closed? It's actually a potentially complicated issue and simple. My understanding is that legally, states do have the power to decide whether they put in place shelter-in-place laws for pandemics. I couldn't cite to you the constitutional law on that or statutory law. That's what I've heard from actual legal experts. And just like with anything else with COVID-19, I'll learn from the experts on that. I'm not an epidemiologist, so my opinion of what to do is do what the epidemiologists are saying. So my understanding is states can do that, and as far as whether governors have the authority to do this, it depends on their states. So my understanding is Tim Walz is completely in the clear legally, but it does raise a bigger question, because it's easy to say we should do what the states want to do instead of the federal government when the states are getting the right results. Turn that around. Imagine that the president was the smart one. If Obama is still in office and he's making scientifically informed decisions and he's not pushing medicine that is untested and which he's personally invested. Okay, so we probably want to listen to Obama. And imagine all the governors are like our neighbor in South Dakota, Christine Neem, or that Ron DeSantis down in Florida. They're all idiots and being stupid about it. Now, should the states be able to defy the federal government? Well, no, in this case, now I want the feds to have authority. And that's always the problem with states' rights. You will find that federal supremacy is supported by those who like what the federal government is doing. States' rights are supported by those who oppose what the federal government is doing. And pretty much always, these arguments are very situational of which side that you're on. So the best thing to do is have both smart governors and smart presidents. And I'm honestly not sure about exactly where the Constitution comes into play and all that. Pumped water is a big investment. It is a long-term project. What can we do locally in our district to conserve or generate energy? We have a problem in this inner suburban urban district because we have more limitations. We don't have a lot of space, so it's hard to put up wind turbines, and finding open space for solar farms. We're not going to do that. I'm willing to encourage home solar. I think that it's small potatoes compared to big solar farms and big wind farms, but in our own district, we could do that. We could encourage rooftop solar. We can inform homeowners about ways that they can conserve, how to do a rain garden. Perhaps there are buildings where if they can't do rooftop solar, they might be able to have like a rooftop garden, and that still cools it. And in conservation, I'm a big supporter of bike lanes and bike paths because I'm a bicyclist. That is completely 100% self-serving. Every little bit helps. Every bit of conservation buys us time to cure global warming. It just doesn't fix it. It just buys us time. I'm waving, sorry. it buys us time to do something. That's why I'm focused on energy storage. But yeah, I would do the smaller things like that. Not just bike lanes that serve me, but things that serve other people. Like I would like to see more mass transit in terms of if we can make the trains more frequent, especially now that we're worried about how crowding on rush hour trains or post-game trains and buses at rush hour might spread a pandemic. We can maybe spread out the crowding by having more runs of the buses. That would probably encourage people to get back to using mass transit. I'm guessing there's going to be a big fall off of that after COVID-19. Single payer as a Minnesota law. I'm in favor of that. I like Senator John Marty's Minnesota health plan. In terms of getting something just done immediately, Governor Dayton had proposed letting anybody at all buy into Minnesota Care. And that's letting people buy into the existing private system that has all the problems of the private system, but at least it's something. And it could be done in a short term. So I would be in favor of that, not as a long-term solution. Long-term solution, I'd like to move to a single payer system. Short-term, let's just get everybody health care. And yeah, speaking of which, let's not be shy about using this coronavirus pandemic to push for ideas that we're right about, like everybody ought to have access to health care and everybody ought to have paid sick leave. I spent a lot of my working life without health insurance or paid sick leave. I can tell you, I did go to work sick. I wasn't, actually, no, there was a time I was working in food service, working in a restaurant. And I don't know that I ever passed an infection onto somebody, but I would drag myself into work. It wouldn't have occurred to me not to go in. And I promise you that during this pandemic, there have been people who were starting to feel symptoms, but the bills had to be paid and they still went in and they could spread the infection to their coworkers. They could spread it to their customers, especially considering in food industries, people who work in warehouses or the supermarkets. You know, they're always often working for low wages with no benefits, with no health insurance and no paid sick leave. And they're handling your food. So now it doesn't sound like maybe it would be a good idea to let everybody have health insurance, everybody have paid sick leave. So absolutely, I would use the coronavirus pandemic to push for that because we were right. And we should not be shy about saying so, especially because Republicans will have no problems talking about how we need to react to this pandemic by cutting rich people's taxes again. Okay, what about water towers? You're thinking for the pumped hydro, I assume, and I've wondered that too. If it could work with a tall enough water tower, the right shape of water tower. They've been done in places where they built reservoirs, and we're not as hilly. You know, we have some hills, but not as many as Tennessee. But I've wondered too if a water tower might work. I know the engineering problem is that when you've got a smaller quantity of water, you just don't have as much gravity pulling it down, you know, the pressure behind it. So you don't get as much of the energy returned when the water comes back down. So the bigger the scale, the more you get. But maybe there's a way that, you know, with a different shaped water tower, we could get a usable amount of energy. Because if we recover just half of the stored energy, that's half the energy that we wouldn't have had because it would have just disconnected it from the grid when there was no place to put it. So absolutely, let's try that. Minnesota used to offer tax benefits for solar, but Republicans took them away. Restore them? Yeah, let's do it. And hey, you know, it's not like it's a fair competition. Did you hear the news? Yeah, today. I was listening to the radio, so I couldn't point to the source, but the Trump administration is trying to have subsidies for the oil industry because it's been hit so hard by the collapse in oil prices. So they're going to save the oil industry. Now, if there was a collapse in solar prices, do you think they'd save the solar panel industry? No. So it's not going to be a free market where everything just competes equally and everything bears its costs. No, it isn't, and never has been. Just the fact that we don't have a carbon tax means that when we burn fossil fuels, part of those costs are externalized, which is a jargony word for somebody else is made to pay for it. Somebody else has to deal with the air pollution from the fossil fuels that I burn. And maybe it goes around, it comes around because I'm having to pay for somebody else's pollution, maybe. But when the costs are externalized, we're not seeing the real cost of our burning of fossil fuels. And now we're talking about subsidizing them. And we already often had, you know, low rent or low royalties for pumping and mining on government land. So yeah, let us subsidize renewable energy. Let's subsidize the solar panels on rooftops. Let's build wind turbines. And something I read recently, geothermal has been like twice as expensive as fossil fuels. And most of the cost is the cost of drilling. It's just expensive to drill, but that's where almost all the cost of geothermal is. Well, because of the collapse of the oil industry, the cost of drilling has plunged. So I don't know if Minnesota has good locations for geothermal, but wouldn't that be great? We should sure look into that. All right. Well, actually, I'm caught up on the questions that I had submitted beforehand, and I see I've kept people here longer. Oh, one more. Do you have experience of a fired up MAGA person confronting you or someone like that? How would you handle being confronted for your politics? Yeah, I have. The first thing that comes to mind is when I was volunteering at the DFL's booth at the state fair, and every time I do, I have a conversation like this. There's always some conservative who comes in who wants an argument, and I find if I'm calm, rational, I have to shout because it's noisy there. But but if it's, it's clear I'm just shouting to be heard and not to be obnoxious. I often can have a conversation with them, find a bit of common ground. And like I remember talking to one person, it's obviously when the Affordable Care Act was still going through Congress. And I asked somebody, what about letting anybody at all buy into Medicare? What we're now talking about is a public option, Medicare for anybody. And surprisingly, his response was, well, yeah. I mean, he was afraid of the ACA, but just let anybody buy into Medicare. Yeah, conservatives are all for that. And actually, I think that's a good issue to run on because that has like 70% support in the polls. And once people learn that, Medicare for anybody works, I think it will be a step to Medicare for everybody. People will figure out we don't really need the private health insurance industry. And I don't mean to be offensive to anybody who works in the private health insurance industry. You need your job. If I was offered a job, and I would take it too. But it's an industry that we don't really need. Healthcare needs to be a public service. We need to look at it like fire and police. It's ridiculous. You got to pay for an ambulance. It's weird we privatize this thing. It should be a public service. So yeah, Medicare for anybody, Medicare for everybody. I think that we can make this work. I think, yeah, I really kind of wandered away from the question, Paul. I was asking
other examples.
Yeah, example of how you handle your being confronted for your politics. Probably happens online. You get flamed once in a while, and I just don't respond. I mean, if you argue with an idiot, people who are watching can't tell the difference between you and the idiot. It's there's tempting to say, I'm not going to tolerate being insulted, but what's the point? And in person, it's different than online. People can usually get past that. And as you can guess, I've been doing a lot of conversing during this campaign. I've had a lot of conversations where people disagreed with me, and that's okay. I mean, somebody who's with you 90% of the time is with you. I am happy. I'm pleased as punch to be able to vote for candidates who are with me 80% of the time, 90% of the time. That's terrific. I'll take it. And people are people. And if you can get a Republican out of the bubble, you can still get along with them. And as long as you're not trying to, if you're not trying to be confrontational, probably they won't be either. And if they do want to yell, just, you accept that, all right, we're not going to have a conversation. It's just not worth my time. Obama should have had the guts to stay with the public option. I think he tried. Remember the Senate filibuster? Yeah, like Tim mentions, Ben Nelson and also Joe Lieberman, those two. We only had 58 votes, and they would not get us to 60 without taking out the public option. And that's why we don't have it. I would rather that, in a way, we killed the filibuster because, yeah, we've used it once in a while, but Republicans use it a lot more. Conservatives have used it far, far more over the whole time the filibusters existed, blocking. That's why anti-lynching laws didn't pass for decades. And they blocked civil rights legislation for a long time. The Civil Rights Act took like 15 years to pass, and it took a really big liberal majority. So it's a danger, but maybe we should just get rid of the filibuster, because without that, we easily had the votes for the public option. Easily. All right. I told everybody that I would try and wrap this up in like a half hour, and it's 7:45. So I'm going to be respectful of folks' time. So thank you so much for coming along. So if you don't see the chat, I probably should have said this at the beginning. I'm not sure if the chat shows up when you watch the video replay later. So try not to be, I hope you weren't confused by the references to somebody saying something in the chat. And I guess we'll call it a night, and I will put this into form where it'll be sitting on my YouTube channel. Please hop over to my channel, watch some of the other videos. I have to admit, the signs video, a little proud of that one. My brother and I came up with that. We thought it was very clever, and I thought more people would watch it. We kind of liked it. Go watch the signs video. Both my brother and I will be feeling a lot better. All right. Well, thank you, folks, who joined in the chat, and thank you for anybody who was not in the chat but lurking around. And is that the right term? Yeah. All right. And I will call that a stream, clicking the end stream button right now.